Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Pericles' Funeral Oration, which is recorded in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian Wars. Now this is the first of probably 3 videos I'm going to be making about Thucydides. One about the Melian dialogue and one about the history as a whole. But I think Pericles' Funeral Oration is a particularly important component of the history, so I wanted to talk about it specifically. And it's especially important for me in terms of the research that I'm doing, because Pericles' Funeral Oration is a really good document in terms of explaining how Athenian democracy worked, or at least how Athenians wanted it to be perceived as working. And that's an important distinction that we'll talk about. But Pericles' Funeral Oration is the second chapter, I think, third chapter of Book 2 of the History of the Peloponnesian War. Essentially, this is toward the end of the first year of the war. Athens is doing pretty well so far, and Thucydides sets the scene for us here. In the same winter, the Athenians, following their annual custom, gave a public funeral for those who had been the first to die in the war. These funerals are held in the following way. 2 days before the ceremony, the bones of the fallen are brought and put in a tent which had been erected, and people make whatever offerings they wish to their own dead. Then there is a funeral procession in which coffins of cypress wood are carried on wagons. There is one coffin for each tribe, which contains the bones of members of that tribe. One empty bier is decorated and placed in the procession. This is for the missing, whose bodies could not be recovered. Everyone who wishes to, both citizens and foreigners, can join in the procession, and women who are related to the dead are there to make their laments at the tomb. The bones are laid in the public burial place, which is in the most beautiful quarter outside the city walls. Here the Athenians always bury those who have fallen in war. So this setup is important, in part because it records this ritual, and the ritual activities of the ancient Greeks are very, very interesting. They're typically relatively well documented compared to a lot of rituals in other ancient civilizations, in part because of people like Thucydides. But this idea of the state having an obligation to those who have died in wars is a central one in 5th and 4th century BCE Athens. And this, along with this, goes not just public honors for those who have fallen in battle, but the state would actually arm and support the orphans of those who have lost their fathers in battle. So that's an interesting thing. Another interesting point that Thucydides makes here is that women are involved in this ritual. They are there to lament, but women in ancient Athens, 6th, 5th, and 4th century BCE Athens, did not really have much of a public role. They were not particularly members of society in the way that in some other ancient cultures, like among the Egyptians, I think women had more of a position. Spartan women had somewhat more of a position, though I think there's debate about exactly how much of a real public position they had. But in Athens, women had very few rights and they had very few public roles. There's even stringent debate about whether or not women went to the theater. And it's worth remembering, in 5th century and 4th century BCE Athens, the theater performances were part of the festival of Dionysus. Multiple festivals of Dionysus. The city Dionysia and the Linnea. And there's disagreement among classicists on whether or not women were allowed to attend those festivals. And so it's worth noting here in Thucydides' setup for this particular ritual that women are playing a role here. We'll come back to the important... Actually, we'll just skip ahead to the end of Pericles' funeral oration, where he specifically addresses the position of women, or the obligation of women. And now, a little bit before this bit that I'm going to read you, he had said, those of you who have lost sons or whatever in the wars, you should try and have more kids, because that's really going to perk you up. But he says here at the very end of his speech, perhaps I should say a word or two on the duties of women to those among you who are now widowed. I can say all I have to say in a short word of advice. Your great glory is not to be inferior to what God has made you, and the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether they are praising you or criticizing you. Fantastic. So, to be fair, the central focus of Pericles' funeral oration is not on the role of women in Athenian society, which is abundantly clear, because his only advice is basically just stay in the shadows and don't draw any attention to yourself. So that's not great, but that does tell us very specifically about the role of women in Athenian society, which was an extremely minimal one. For as much as Athens presents itself as this sort of bastion of freedom and democracy and individual liberty, and Pericles does present it this way, that freedom and individual liberty clearly did not extend to women. So, what does Pericles actually talk about? Well, he establishes his purpose relatively near the beginning of the speech. He sort of initially gives the context of the speech and why he doesn't feel it's that crucial that he spend too much time praising those who have fallen, because everybody knows their virtue anyway. And he explains his purpose. What I want to do is, in the first place, to discuss the spirit in which we faced our trials, and also our constitution and the way of life which has made us great. After that I shall speak in praise of the dead, believing that this kind of speech is not inappropriate to the present occasion, and that this whole assembly of citizens and foreigners may listen to it with advantage. So basically, this is a speech in praise of Athens, ultimately. That's Pericles' objective here. So he describes specifically the democratic constitution of Athens. He says, our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. No one, so long as he has it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty. And just as our political life is free and open, so is our day-to-day life and our relations with each other. We do not get into a state with our next-door neighbor if he enjoys himself in his own way, nor do we give him the kind of black looks which, though they do no real harm, still do hurt people's feelings. We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. So, this is one of the key things. And this is not the only point Pericles makes about democracy. In a little while, he goes on and he talks about how each individual, really he means here each citizen, and that's an important distinction, that each individual is interested not only in his own affairs, but in the affairs of the state as well. So he talks about how Athenians are committed to the collective good, that because they have a democratic system, each person, citizen, is engaged with the state because he has a personal vested interest in it. And I'm not accidentally using a generic male pronoun there. Beyond what I've already said about women having virtually no role in Athenian public life, citizenship in Athens was quite a limited scope. Perhaps only a quarter of the population were citizens. So in order to be a citizen of Athens, you obviously had to be male. You obviously had to not be a slave. And I think, I forget when this changed, but I think early on, like 6th century, as long as one of your parents was an Athenian citizen, you would be born an Athenian citizen. Later on, it was changed so that both of your parents had to be citizens in order for you to be a citizen. So, when Pericles talks about each individual is invested, each individual power is divided among the people, what he really means is power is divided among this maybe quarter of the total population. So that, again, excludes women, it excludes slaves, it excludes foreigners. Resident foreigners were called metics, and they were not citizens and had no public voice in Athenian political life. And so when Pericles is talking about this, it's important to recognize that he's talking about a very small portion of the population who had a much greater say over the political life of Athens than citizens do in contemporary representative democracies. So countries like the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, places like this, where we have elected leadership, we tend to have a much broader base of citizenship than they did in ancient Athens. But because we don't have direct democracy, so like I can't go to Congress and cast a vote. I can vote for the people in Congress, but then if they do things completely contrary to what they said they were going to do, there's not much I can do about it. So we don't have direct democracy. We have representative democracy, whereas Athens had direct democracy with an extremely limited franchise. And this is what Pericles is talking about, is this particular type of democracy. And it's an important thing. It's an important document, Pericles' Funeral Oration, because it tells us maybe how Athens actually functioned during the time of the Peloponnesian War, but certainly the way that Athens wanted to be perceived as functioning. And it's very, very interesting because in the history of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides gives us a number of speeches, some of which he was actually there for, but the vast majority he almost certainly wasn't. Pericles' Funeral Oration, I don't know, he very well might have been there. It was a major Athenian state festival. He was alive at the time. He might very well have been there. But the funeral oration we get in Thucydides is not a transcription. He was not there like writing down word for word, scribbling furiously as Pericles was speaking. And the thing that Thucydides says about the way that he presents speeches is he presents them... I should be able to find it because it's an important bit in terms of Pericles, or in terms of Thucydides' own words. He says, okay, I found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as close as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speakers say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation. So Pericles' funeral oration, again, this is not a transcription of what Pericles said. This is a kind of weird balance between the gist of what he said and what Thucydides believes he should have said. And that's actually really interesting because Pericles gives us a pretty glowing description of Athenian democracy, whereas Thucydides is not that keen on democracy. He was more inclined to the oligarchic party. At various points, there were attempts by oligarchs in Athens or from outside of Athens to try and subvert Athenian democracy. And while Thucydides, was never, I don't think, involved in an actual coup attempt, he was not unsympathetic to these figures. But the other thing that I really find striking and interesting about Pericles' funeral oration is this bit just a little ways after his main sort of description of democracy as the power vested in the people. He says, "The greatness of our city brings it about that all good things from all over the world flow into us, so that to us it seems just as natural to enjoy foreign goods as our own local products. Then there is a great difference between us and our opponents and our attitude toward military security. Here are some examples. Our city is open to the world, and we have no periodical deportations in order to prevent people observing or finding our secrets, which might be of military advantage to the enemy." So the reason I find this really striking, for a couple of reasons. One is Pericles is here touting the cosmopolitanism of Athens as a positive strength, whereas other city-states, in particular a city-state like Sparta, was very, very cautious and very, very traditional, very almost xenophobic in its distrust of outsiders. Athens was very open to other cultures, other ideas, people from other places, and that was one of their great strengths. In fact, the classicist Edith Hall argues in her book, I think it's called Introducing the Greeks, that the thing that made the Greeks great as a civilization, especially the Athenians, was that they traveled all over the place and they were willing to take ideas from other people and blend them together and figure out the best ways of doing things. So for Pericles to say our cosmopolitanism is one of the things that makes us a thriving city-state and a thriving empire, I think is really, really important. The other thing that I think is very striking about this is the casual entitlement to empire that Pericles is expressing here. Because the reality is, it's not that Athens was so great that people from elsewhere in the world were like, take our stuff. Athens built its naval strength and its economic strength, as well as its cultural strength, by exacting tribute from its allies in the Delian League. So that was one of the things, was every city-state or every colony, Athenian colony, that was allied with Athens either needed to contribute money or contribute ships. And Athens was effectively in control of all of those resources. So yes, they were getting stuff from all over the Greek-speaking world and beyond. Part of that was through actual trade, but a lot of that was through demanding tribute in exchange for military security. And so, again, this is one of those things where Pericles' funeral oration is an incredibly important testament to how Athenian society worked, particularly politically, but it's also an idealized representation, and we need to be cautious about how much we take Pericles at his word here.